Today, Kevin Bean will be looking at the question of the First International and what happened to it, basically from 1864 to 76. And I'm looking forward to it. Comrades, if you have any questions or want to make a comment, either click the button raise hand or put it in the chat and I can read it out. Thank you very much. Hello, Kevin.
Good evening, comrades. Tonight's talk is a bit of a continuation from a talk that Mark Mulholland gave a few weeks ago on socialist ideas. So any of you that were in that talk, you'll hear some very familiar things there. And also it's developed in one aspect in greater depth next week in Alex Price's talk on the Paris Commune. So the First International was the first real international working class party, and as such is the model, or is very influential over succeeding international movements, particularly the Second International and the Third International. Other internationals and groups obviously take their inspiration from this. The reason why I think it's important for us to look at this is that in many ways, when we look at the history of the First International, we're looking at really the origins of many of our current left-wing politics. And indeed, when we look through the minutes of the General Council, we see many familiar issues, even down to the mundane nature of the minutes, worrying about finance, disputes about representation and so on. In many ways, you have a real feeling of deja vu, that you're sort of stepping back into any meeting, any committee meeting of the labour movement. But I think there's a very important difference between our sort of sense that this is all part of a routine, that this is in fact one of the first organisations of its type. So it's breaking ground. But it isn't just in the mundane nature of organisation, but it's actually in the politics of the First International, and indeed the discussions about the nature of its organisation, its tactics and its strategy. Indeed, many of the basic questions that we have in contemporary socialist politics, I mean, we're having them at the moment in the LLA, they're being debated in and around the left in the Labour Party, and we can really see similar questions being discussed. For example, whether organisations should have a clear programme, how broad the organisation should be. Should it include those people who are perhaps less committed to socialism, maybe have different visions or versions of socialism? Questions of tactics. Should the organisation be centralised and a disciplined organisation around a particular programme, or should it be a wider federation? And these questions are all being discussed in the 1860s and into the 1870s. And there's plenty of quite interesting material for comrades to have a go at there. One of the good things as well about this material is, unlike some of the earlier movements that we studied, the minutes and indeed the proclamations and the addresses and so on do appear online. They're quite easily available. The Marxist Internet Archive has got plenty of this material, and it's very well worth looking up. So before we begin, I want to perhaps talk about the origins of the First International. It was founded formally in September 1864 at a meeting in London at St. Martin's Hall, and it was established as the International Working Men's Association. Obviously, in a period before formal political and gender equality, the title working men would be the predominant one, but there were women members and women supporters, but obviously the predominant body, as in the labour movement generally, was still male. The movement itself in that very first meeting really covered the whole gamut of radical and socialist movements. The chair of the meeting, for example, was Professor Beazley, a positivist historian from the University of London, and it included Proudhonists, French petty bourgeois socialists. It included English trade unionists, quite respectable trade unionists in their way, Mazzinians, Italian nationalists and radical Democrats. It included all sorts of exiles from across Europe who had gathered in London, had sort of turned up in London, as it were, as a refuge from the oppression that they faced in Europe. And of course, it included Karl Marx. Marx was not, in a sense, the original instigator of this, this meeting, but he was very important in it. And indeed, he drew up most of the founding documents, the charters, the statements, and indeed he's going to be the guiding light for much of the work of the International throughout its history. Now, the idea of an international organization of the working class is, this is the first movement of that kind, but there were quite a few forerunners. And indeed, the idea of international solidarity, of radicals and Democrats working internationally, having common interests, is something that can clearly be seen in the French Revolution, although I think its forerunners might also be seen in some of the radical movements in Europe in the 17th century. But the idea that tyranny was universal and that the victory of democracy over in one country would spell a blow against tyranny in another was very widely established. And this was particularly true in England, and particularly true in and around the Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s. This was formalized in an organization called the Society of Fraternal Democrats, which was established in the middle 1840s and does include some communists and some left socialists, many of whom are also associated with groups that Marx is involved with in that period. The Fraternal Democrats were also quite influential in the left wing of Chartism, and their argument was primarily that the workers and democratic forces internationally had common interests, and they looked for the union of those movements. They looked for the union of those interests to strike a blow for freedom. And this was because in the period that we're talking about in the 1840s, the big struggles were obviously social and economic. The growth of capitalism meant that factory conditions, wages, social conditions were very important. But there were also other important political struggles, struggles for political representation. In no country in Europe in that period does the working class have the right to vote. The vote is generally restricted insofar as there's any democratic representation at all. And of course, the other important movements are national movements against national oppression, movements for national democracy. In any number of countries, you have these national movements. Some of the important ones will, of course, flare up into national revolutions in 1848 that Mark had talked about in one of his previous sessions. But increasingly, national movements in countries like Italy and in Poland were the focus of working class attention. And particularly for Marx and for many of the more radical socialists, the idea of liberating Poland from Tsarist oppression, but also because Poland had been partitioned in the 1790s. And this would then, in a sense, open up all sorts of opportunities for further revolutionary movements. So Poland was often the focus of attention, but people in Britain followed national movements really throughout Europe. When foreign dignitaries visited, particularly those associated with radical governments, they often received public barracking and demonstrations against them. Famously, one of the leaders of the Habsburg counter-revolution was jeered through the streets when he visited London in the 1850s, and more or less had to sort of take refuge away from the crowds. So there was a great deal of interest in struggles throughout the world, and This, of course, is then heightened in the 1860s, not only by the Polish insurrection in 1863, but the Franco-Austrian War and the development of the movement for the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy. So ideas of national democracy, of national unification, and indeed of struggles for democracy were really very significant. And of course, in Britain, we have the remnants of the Chartist movement, but also the revival of movements for political democracy in the 1860s, which will culminate in the Reform League and the concession of the Reform Act of 1867, which extends the franchise to sections of the working class. The franchise is still very restricted. So these are quite major issues where we're in a period of some ferment. And after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions across Europe, after the collapse of Chartism, the 1860s sees some revival in the working class movement. That revival, particularly in Britain, is very much connected to the development of capitalism and the expansion of capitalist industry. But it's also the same across Europe. Countries are industrializing, towns are growing, cities, urban areas are growing, railways are expanding, communications are developing. So we have a period of tremendous transformation. Again, I think Mark Mulholland in his talk on 1848 drew attention to that. And this idea of progress and of development and so on is, I think, a very important feature of what we're going to see with the First International. But we also have the idea that the working class isn't just a class that is oppressed, isn't just a group of people who have grievances, but it's also a class that can start to take matters into its own hands. And not just to protest and to agitate for the right to vote, not just to try to put a veto on policy, but also to extend its own demands. In one of the opening addresses that Marx drafts for the First International, he talks about the positive features that the working class movement is developing. He talks about the growth of industry, but the contradictions of the working conditions, living conditions of the working class. But he talks about the gains that have been achieved through political action, the 10-hour Act, and the idea in particular of controlling time, of trying to claw back some time, trying to claw back something from the capitalists, and that this is an achievement of the working class through political action, through political pressure. And of course, the idea as well that this is not just a domestic issue, but that the working class has an international policy. And indeed, this is one of the features of the International, that it grows out of solidarity with movements across Europe, indeed movements across the world. And in the opening addresses, there are very strong references to the situation in Poland and in the Caucasus and Russian oppression and so on. So these moods are developing, these forces are developing, and they come together in this meeting. Now, as I said, the meeting is drawn up of several different currents, and as you might expect, there are often difficulties in holding those currents together. And indeed, Marx draws attention to this. We've got a very extensive correspondence that Marx has with Engels, but also with other members of the General Council and so on, talking about what he sees as the strategic problems. He is also very well aware that the politics that he advanced in 1847, 1848, expressed in the Communist Manifesto, that movement has gone, and that in many ways he's now addressing a new situation, he's addressing a new group of people who are operating in different circumstances. So he's now working how to approach them, the best ways of expressing this. But what the International does lay down are a number of very key principles. And those principles are significant when we think of the situation that I've described, in which there are a whole series of movements for democracy, for national liberation, and also movements for social change. And many of those movements are led by members of the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie as well. So Marx's key theme is the independence of the working class. And he lays this point very clearly, although in the early period of the International, there are many different elements within it. His main focus is on the role of the working class as the revolutionary class. And if you look at the general rules of the First International, which are drawn up in October 1864, you can see this very clearly. Considering, it says, that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves, that the struggle for the emancipation of the working classes means not a struggle for class privileges and monopolies, but for equal rights and duties and the abolition of all class rule. It then goes on to say that the emancipation of labor is neither a local nor a national, but a social problem, embracing all countries in which modern society exists, and depending for its solution on the concurrence, practical and theoretical, of the most advanced countries. And it then concludes for this section that the present revival of the working classes in the most industrious countries of Europe, while it raises a new hope, gives solemn warning against a relapse into the old errors and calls for the immediate combination of the still disconnected movements. So this focus on the working class, that the emancipation of the working class must be the action of the working class itself, and above all to sort of learn from the mistakes from the past is very important here. Now, Marx had established much of this in the Communist Manifesto, and the idea of the international nation of the working class is quite central to the Communist Manifesto. The phrase "workers of all countries unite" is a key demand there. So it's, I think, this that the International is trying to bring into being. The organization of the International consists of a number of elements. The basic unit is a branch, and that branch then has a direct relationship to the General Council. There are also individual members. There are also some federations, and there are also affiliated bodies. For those of us that have recently been involved in constructing constitutions, this will all be quite familiar. Much of this organization reflects, I think, the state of working class organization at the time. So, for example, in Britain, many of the people involved are trade unionists. Now, the trade unions in this period are predominantly organizations of skilled workers. They're actually quite small. These are often the better paid workers, and the sort of trades that we're talking about, bronze workers, shoemakers, tailors, now seem quite esoteric. Probably only a few, such as the engineers, would correspond to our idea of a sort of a mass trade union. The other point about those unions is that they are really, or not really, are solely the preserver of skilled workers. The great mass of unskilled workers have little or no organization at all. So in attempting to build a movement connected to those trade unions, the First International is clearly dealing with the better off and the better organized sections of the working class. And those sections of the working class will see the need for political representation. Indeed, the idea of limiting working hours, the idea of getting political representation in parliament through the extension of the suffrage, and above all, presenting working class demands, are all quite central to them. And indeed, the British trade unions are very much moving towards a model that we're familiar with. There's the first national conference of trade unions takes place in 1866. And indeed, at that conference, a motion is passed calling upon unions to affiliate to the First International, and many of them do. But of course, the British situation is in many ways unique in Europe at this point. In other countries, the working class movement has different forms and reflects the society and the economy of those countries. So, for example, in Southern Europe, particularly in France, Italy, and Spain, large-scale industry of the sort that has developed in Britain is less predominant, and much of the working class movement there is influenced by petty bourgeois ideas, often of small artisan workshops. And in fact, the proletariat, or the idea of the proletariat, as distinct, say, from another grouping called the working classes, which would include sections of artisans, that grouping is often regarded as sort of enslaved. It's often regarded quite negatively by some sections of the labor movement. So we have the paradox that the proletariat that Marx is interested in and believes is the revolutionary class is not only small in some of the Southern European countries, but is also not a key feature of the politics, which tend to focus on small producers, on petty bourgeois artisan production. So that means that the politics of these countries often focus on mutualism. They often focus on not overthrowing capitalism and replacing it with a socialist system. They often focus on the transformation of society through cooperatives, through mutual aid, for example, through the support for small family cooperatives, small industry, and seeing this as the natural basis of an economy. In other words, in a way, sort of rather nostalgically looking back to the small workshop. And this, of course, will be reflected in the more anarchistic ideas of people like Proudhon, who's very important in France and also in parts of French-speaking Switzerland. And then, of course, into the other countries of Northern Europe, into Germany, into the Netherlands, into Belgium, and so on. Their different economies will also be reflected there. Germany is a rather different case in that it's starting to develop industry. Indeed, in the Ruhr area, it's had quite developed industry since the 1820s and 30s. Engels himself comes from one of those industrial districts. And in Germany, you have some quite interesting developments. Unions are often quite weak, but educational associations, which are often set up under the patronage of liberal manufacturers, merchants, and so on and so forth, these organizations can be quite strong. And it will be these that will become the basis of the General German Workers' Union, led by a rather flamboyant character, Lassalle, who again Marx has talked about in his session. So you have then different sets of movements in different countries, all at different levels of consciousness, but all facing different political problems. In Germany, it's a very restrictive society, repression of the workers' movement, and of course there isn't such a place as Germany. There's a Germany culturally, but it's with various different states which will need to be unified, which they are during the course of the 1860s and into 1870, 1871. And then, of course, in France, you've got Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's regime, which again is very repressive towards the working class, and likewise in Spain and Italy. And of course, in Belgium, which has probably got, it was probably the second country to industrialize in Europe. you again have got very strong anti-trade union laws, very repressive policies. So the movement is different in different countries, and this again is reflected in the International itself. Now, the other feature of the International isn't only its local organizations and its affiliations, but also its meetings and its communications. The General Council, which is based in London and is really made up of London-based people, usually exiles from the various countries concerned, is in contact with the various sections and the various elements of the International. And so we do get an idea of what's happening in different countries. But of course, the most interesting feature, and again, it goes back to the nature of the world that is developing, is of course international meetings. And from 1865, there are a series of international conferences. Mostly they take place in Switzerland, but the first one in 1865 is in London, followed by Geneva, Lausanne. There's then one in Brussels, then Basel, and then then The Hague in the Netherlands in 1872, London also in 1871. And again, the interesting thing is that people are traveling, they're meeting to discuss, and the conferences, the congresses are points where politics and strategy are discussed. And what starts to emerge in these conferences are very clear differences about the nature of politics, and in particular, the nature of the sort of strategy that should be developed by the labor movement. Should, for example, there be a Proudhonist approach, the idea of support for mutualist and cooperative organizations that would, in a sense, hollow out capitalism from within. Capitalism would be replaced by this cooperative commonwealth. And this, of course, would not require political action. It wouldn't require a political party. It wouldn't require legislation. It wouldn't require the seizure of state power. It would simply be the challenge of capitalism from within in that way. Also, this type of approach was quite opposed to strikes, trade unions, industrial militancy of that sort, seeing as a diversion and arguing that the future society should be built in the here and now. But there are also other tendencies. That one, particularly associated with Proudhon, was very strong in France, and indeed at several of the conferences there were quite sharp disagreements and divisions over these questions. There are also disagreements on, for example, whether the international or whether the working class movement should be agitating for the right to vote, whether it should be pushing forward for collectivization, for example, state ownership of industries, question of private property, and indeed, the minutes of the congresses show, the sort of way that these ideas are being sort of thrashed out in this way. And I suppose what's interesting from our point of view, looking back at the contribution that Marx and others are making in this period, is that they are trying to engage with a movement that's starting to come to life, but it's got all sorts of contradictory features. And this is Marx writing actually not long after the initial meeting, but you can see some of the problems. He's writing to Engels, and he says, "It was very difficult to manage things in such a way that our views could secure expression in a form acceptable to the labour movement in its present form. A few weeks hence, these same British labour leaders will be hobnobbing with Bright and Cobden." Those are radical leaders, sort of radicals, liberals, at meetings to demand an extension of the franchise. It will take time before the reawakened movement will allow us to speak with the old boldness. And what we're having here, I think, is this movement coming to life, and then the problem for socialists of how to intervene in it, how to secure support, and indeed how to pitch demands. What sort of things should we be saying? How should we be organized? And the debates then go to and fro about the issue of centralization. Should the General Council be the sort of central directing body, or should there be more decentralization? Should, for example, the various local branches and the local sections more or less proceed in their own ways, or should there be a more centralized directing form? Now, what gives quite strong form to these discussions is the emergence of very clear political tendencies. And Marx and his followers represent one tendency, but another one, which is associated with Proudhon and the French, is, as I've said, a sort of petty bourgeois socialism that is politically defeated, and by the late 1860s, I think, is ceased really to be important. But there is another tendency which we associate with the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin of anarchism, and this tendency is very clearly in opposition to, again, the main lines that Marx and indeed the movements that are emerging in Germany and in Northern Europe are expressing. And it's here again, I think, that we see sort of modern disagreements. We see again debates about strategy, about the role of the working class. Bakunin is arguing for, I suppose, of anarchism in the sense of the rejection of any form of state, of opposition to the established order, the particularly support for terrorism and for that type of political violence. But the other issue that makes this so significant is in the organizational form. Bakunin organizes his followers in a clandestine organization, and that clandestine organization is aiming, through what Marx and his followers describe as intrigue, to control the international. And they do this in the name of decentralization, of accusing the General Council and indeed of the leadership of wanting to control power in their own hands. And so there's quite a tussle at congresses, not only around political positions, but around organizational forms. And for much from the late 1860s, this culminates in a struggle at the Hague Conference, in which, in effect, Marx and his political approach wins, but by this point the international is split. There is, in a sense, an anarchist international, and the international continues in that form until 1876. But in a sense, it's already gone. It's already sort of died in this period. Now, what I've left out in the midst of all of this is, of course, the Paris Commune, and that's partly because Alex is going to look at it next week. But I think the Paris Commune is important because it really does bring the international through to public notice. One of the amusing things when we read the editorials from the various newspapers, the Times, the Observer, and so forth, is that they attribute tremendous powers and support to the international. They argue that it has the support of millions of working people across the globe, that it has massive finances, and that it is, in a sense, a sort of sinister power. And when we look at the minutes, we see that this is really far from the truth. And much of this, of course, is because of the Paris Commune, which is associated with the international. And although there are supporters of the international who are involved in the Commune, it's by no means directed by the International. The International organizes solidarity actions, and what I think is quite interesting here is that we see for the first time the discussion of how socialists and the working class movement should approach wars. In 1869, at the Basel Conference, the International argues that imperialist wars, or wars between tyrants and so on, can be stopped by a general strike of workers. And this, of course, will link into the debates in the Second International, and indeed debates about the outbreak of the First World War and the response of social democratic leaders to that event. And what Marx argues here in an address that he writes on behalf of the International is that workers have no interest in the wars of their masters, that they have no interest in dynastic wars, and that the expression of opinion, of support between French and German workers during that war shows the internationalist potential that there is. But Marx also and his followers in Germany pay a heavy price for their opposition to the aggressive war. August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht are deputies in the Reichstag, and they vote against war credits. They speak out against the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, and they put a very strong case, and they're clearly speaking as representatives of the international working class movement. Marx, though, and I think this is again an interesting debate, partly because of the context we've talked about, Marx does believe that the defeat of the French will be historically progressive. It will lead to the overthrow of Louis Napoleon, and it will possibly foment a revolution in France. But also, his argument is that the consolidation of the German state as a result of that war will also be progressive for the working class movement. So we're getting all the debates that are going to come much later on about the nature of war, but also about whether wars can be progressive in any sense, but also this sort of sense of the working class having its own policy and intervening in politics and putting forward its ideas. But it's the Commune that probably, from which the war, the war in a sense, is the context for the development of the Paris Commune, a working class insurrection, which, as I said, will be looked at next week. And that Marx there says that what the Commune does is to embody the key principles of the International. And the International then comes under the public spotlight at trials and at other persecutions that follow. It's the International that's blamed as the group behind the Commune. And indeed, Marx singled out for particular attention. So this brings the International, I think, very much into the spotlight. So I've outlined its history, and I've talked in some ways about its relevance. I think I just want to conclude with a couple of points about, I suppose, where it points towards the future. I think that the first thing is that it's the first movement that tries to translate political ideas into a mass organizational form. And it does this when the working class in different countries is moving into action and is, has different outlooks, different levels of consciousness, different forms of organization. It's very successful on one level, particularly in building links between workers. It assists in many strikes. There are numerous cases of where employers in Britain or France try to use scabs from each country to break strikes, and the International is successful in preventing that. It raises collections. It raises collections for strikes. The bronze workers' strike in Paris is a notable example of which is one because of the collections raised in Britain. It also, I think, develops an independent working class voice, which is growing in the 1860s, so that the organizations which adhered to the International, for example, the group in 1869 that's formed in Germany, which will later, in Eisenach, which will later contribute to the formation of a German Social Democratic Party. This shows the ruling class, it shows the state that the working class has arrived and has to be dealt with, has to be attended to. And it does also begin the idea of distinct independent working class politics, particularly a distinct independent working class policy that looks at foreign affairs, that looks at a world system that doesn't just confine itself to what we might call bread and butter questions, but looks at reordering the world, looks at whether movements, whether states, whether wars are progressive, their impact on human development. And above all, it has this idea that this class, this working class, will be the class that decides the future. That at that point, in few countries in Europe does it have a decisive political say, but that is what it's now campaigning for. So that instead of leaving it up to radical politicians like Cobden and Bright, or leaving it up to Bismarck to develop a form of welfare state in the Kaiserreich, it will be a case now of the workers putting forward their demands, putting forward their programs, and then, as in the case of the Paris Commune, not just putting forward those demands, but creating a revolutionary movement that will actually be able to put those demands into practice. So that's the lesson, I think, of the First International, an inspiring movement, but a movement that has all of the problems of real movements, of political disagreements, of different levels of development. So we can learn, a tremendous number of lessons from it. And I think it's, a balance of its successes and failures. And, as ever, it's the discussion of these issues from where we get the lessons. So I'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Fascinating as always. Comrades, if you have questions or comments, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. While comrades are gathering their courage, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, because that was really quite fascinating. And I wonder if you could, a few issues that I picked up on. Individual membership, how do you do that in an international organization like that? I mean, did everybody always travel to these meetings? It can't have been that easy at the time to, take a week out of your life, etc. So it would have been a rather small section of people who were able to travel there. How many did come to these international conferences? How many people went there? Also, then, it did sound like it was actually that the International helped to create local or national parties, while there was both. And was it both ways? Was it that local groups, national groups helped to set it up, but then also sparked the development of more political organizations on a national or local basis? Because that would be quite an interesting. It's quite difficult to imagine that today, because everything is so national and so localized and stuff. So we have seminars with, webinars with people from across the world, but the idea of actually organizing internationally is further away at the moment, I think, than it has been for a long time. What exists at the moment is things like, the party of the, what's it called, the European Party of the European Left, which is, the German Linke Party, Rifondazione, and what's left of it, those type of organizations. But they're not very, it's not a very vibrant or real organization at all. It's a lash up at the top of these parties, I think set up mainly for European elections, but it's in no way an attempt to organize comrades, to organize members, to organize trade unions, etc., across the globe or Europe. So that's I think that's interesting that it's actually gone backwards like that quite so much. Yeah, a few things, if you could speak about that, that would be lovely. And comrades, please indicate if you want to speak, or there is actually a question in the chat. Have you seen it, Kevin? Okay, I'll bring you in now then.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Give me 2 minutes to have a drink.
Sorry, there's actually somebody
No, that's fine. No, I was being funny. On the individual membership question, there were individual members who appear to have stood outside of branches or federations. So, you know, that it was possible to be an individual member. Most members appear to have been members of branches. We know of the existence of branches. Many of the branches might, for example, be existing organizations that affiliated, for example, trade union branches. But there were, for example, groups of revolutionaries. There were Fenians who were members of the First International. And then, of course, we have the example of the various German groups that were organizing and then affiliated. I mean, in the case of the German movement, Liebknecht in particular, because of his contacts with Marx, he'd been in London with Marx, had come back to Germany and participated in working class organization. So I think what you have there is a sort of both top down and bottom up. My feeling from what I can read in the minutes is that most of the organizations are really sort of homegrown, you know, in the sense that they are, you know, groupings who are trying to establish themselves, and then they see the international as a way of, you know, linking in with these wider groups. The French and the British situation, I think, is different. It's quite an interesting one that the French and British trade unions had some connections really from the 1850s, and it was their I suppose initiative that, you know, that of common solidarity. So these were organizations that existed before. So I think in many ways it is more grassroots than simply, say, a group in London sending out emissaries in that way. We do know, I mean, there are, I can't remember the Congress. I think it was maybe the Geneva Congress of 1866, maybe Lausanne of 1867. But a number of French people turned up as individual members. It wasn't that far to go. And they had to be cleared out of the room on the grounds that it was a delegate conference, and that, you know, just turning up as an individual supporter, you know, didn't give you the right to vote and to participate, because obviously, you know, you had to be able to travel to get there. And that was a good example, I think, of them being fairly strict on the delegate question. The attendances usually, again, as far as I can see from the minutes, range from around about 60 and 70 up to a couple of hundred. Again, you know, representing largely organizations. Although in the case, for example, of the Jura Federation, this was a federation of local societies. And this again would seem to be sort of members. There is, I mean, there's a considerable debate about the size of the International. I've explained that the ruling class set put its numbers at millions. We know, for example, that in 1867 there were 30 British trade unions affiliated who had membership of about 50,000. But as with, you know, contemporary affiliated memberships, how many of them would then be active and so on, I think is, you know, sort of open to question. So I think we have to sort of take the organization, you know, on that level, in that way. Just one point about the localization and the internationalization. And I think this was a point that Mark Mulholland made in his last talk, and it was one that I'd like to really stress, is that really communications in the 1860s were, you know, were comparable to today. Leaving aside the internet and the telephone, rail travel meant that you could actually travel, you know, you could actually travel throughout Europe quite easily. You know, it's obviously not in, you know, as good as modern terms, but it was no longer impossible to consider, for example, you know, Marx attended the 1872 Congress. It was no longer impossible for people to decide to travel, you know, in the 1860s from London to Geneva, you know, if you could afford it or if you were supported in some way. And likewise with communication, you know, we know that delegates carrying documents and materials traveled between different parts of Europe, you know, communicating with each other. And if you think, for example, I mean, admittedly, this is 10, 15 years later, but if you think of the experience of the German Social Democrats during the anti-socialist law, who have a paper printed in Switzerland, and are then smuggle it into Germany, and through the so-called, I think it's the red postbox system, people distribute the paper. So I think communications are, you know, in many ways are actually quite favorable, you know, and in, you know, the fact that we've got better communications, you know, I think is significant, but it's then the contrast between our good communications now and the nature of our movement. A comrade asked about the Russian Obshchina peasant communes. The Russian peasant communes were in a sense survivals of older forms of collective property. I think possibly what you're driving at is whether Russian populism, particularly the group who in the 1870s will become the Narodniks, whether this movement has any connections with the First International. And it's true that there are. I mean, some of the Russian populists, and indeed some of the Bakuninists, are Russian, but they're largely exiles in Western Europe. There will be some Russian Marxists, and again, people like who later become prominent, like Plekhanov and Vera Zasulich, have some connections with the International. But this is, you know, this is, you know, the Russian movement, I think, is very much linked to Russian conditions in that way. So, you know, that's my responses to the questions.
Thank you. While you are listening to the next contributions, there's also a couple of others in the chat. Anne, who can't come on camera because she's walking home, is asking if you could sum up again why it basically came to an end. I guess you talked about the conflict with the anarchists, but was there a bit more than that? Ashley is asking, how did the organizational structure and empowerment through the First International and the post-Chartist movement, how is there a linear line, basically? You know, how did it influence further working class organization, particularly in Britain, and the foundation of the ILP, for example? Okay, I'm bringing in Zivneb now. Wrong pronunciation, I'm sure. Sorry. Hello, comrade. You are still muted.
Yes, it's Zbyszek.
Hello.
But I'm known as Zbigniew, and so I've got about 4 questions for him.
Oh.
Just to, for Kevin, thank you very much, very enlightening. And firstly, the one is about at this time was the international discussing the environment, and the writings at this time were that Marx was writing about, criticizing Liebknecht and the nature of the soil. Again, you know, that it's losing its fruitfulness, and pesticides, arguing, and the question of the metabolic rift, and also the push for harmony with nature, that the movement has to, you know, with the industrialization, the working class has to ensure that Mother Earth is also cared for. So were those debates within the Congresses at all? So if you could answer something about that. I've been reading about it in this, you know, the book by Corley Saito, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing is about, obviously, Poland, about the fact that it ended up that it was Germany and Russia and the Austria-Habsburgs were all trying to influence its development and be the mother of the new nation, and it ended up being, in order to get out of the Tsars, the Prussian state that ensured that happened. And did the International have any role at this time, or was it later, I think? And the final thing is, obviously, Rosa Luxemburg hadn't been born yet, but there were other women of her ilk, or was she like the first real leader of the International in the Second International? Okay, those are the questions. If you could.
Just a few there. Kevin, do you want to reply to a few things now first? Or
yeah, I will do, so I don't forget them.
Yeah.
First of all, in response to Anne on the failure, I think the failure is linked to a number of things. I think, first of all, that the Paris Commune did lead to a split, particularly with the more respectable trade union and reformist leaders in Britain. You know, many of them, there was quite a sort of reaction against the Commune. I mean, you know, the phrase witch hunt comes to mind. You know, those who were less committed, or who were committed, you know, for largely trade union functions and purposes, withdrew. There was obvious repression. I mean, in France, there was, you know, serious repression, and that, I think, had its impact. I think the split, and in particular you know, the very sharp disagreements, did lead to some disillusion. But I think there was also, in many ways, a clear sort of split, which had perhaps possibly been implicit in the International, particularly between, I mean, it does map onto geographical, between Northern Europe with its urbanization, its you know, its industrialization, and its you know, working class, its organizations of that sort, and then those economies like in Spain and Italy, which were much more still based on artisan production. So I think that there were always going to be tensions, and I think that, you know, in many ways those are then reflected in that split. There's also the beginnings of an economic downturn, you know, which are going to affect those countries. And then conversely, in Germany, in the Gründerzeit period, you have sort of economic development. So there are a number of objective and subjective factors there, which I think, you know, contribute to it. But I think that the state repression certainly does, you know, lead to that, you know, that situation. On Zbigniew's questions on eco-socialism and so on, I'm familiar with Marx's writing, particularly his discussion on soil erosion, drawing on the chemical, the biochemistry. I think of is it Liebig or Liebig, It's not the same, by the way, as my German's pretty bad, but it's not the same as Liebknecht, slightly different. I'm not aware from reading the minutes and so on of the congresses that there was any discussion of what we would recognize as eco-socialism or anything of that sort. Marx was writing in Capital about the issues you describe, and indeed you're, in the reference there to the metabolic rift, you're quite right. But I'm not aware that the International took a position on it, other than to talk about, the impact of pollution and, the general pollution and so on through urbanization and living conditions in the working class. But, I can only really go on the published material. It's possible that in some of the local or the national sections, there were articles on these questions, but they would, I think, be always linked at this point to social conditions. I think Marx's views that he's developing in Capital and elsewhere would not at that point have achieved, such wide prominence. So, but I think that's an interesting question. On Poland and on the partition of Poland, Poland in many ways had been one of the things that have brought people together. The rising of 1863 had engendered a lot of protest movements in France and Britain, and so it's the commemoration or solidarity with that rising that's actually quite important. The position that Marx took in the International about the liberation of Poland was, I think, linked very much to the idea that the Tsarist Russia was the leading figure of reaction in Europe. If you consider the way that the Russian Tsarist armies had helped to suppress the risings in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then of course its treatment of Poland and indeed its own populations, you can see that the idea that it was the bulwark of reaction in Europe, and obviously the liberation of Poland would have destabilized that. There's also an important point which, and I'm glad you mentioned that the partition of the 1790s, because of course there were three powers involved in that: Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and large areas of East Prussia or Eastern Prussia were areas in which there was probably a Polish majority. I mean, in Silesia and so on. So the argument that Marx would have advanced there was probably comparable to that of his support for the Fenians, that a country that oppresses another, can never truly be free. So I think that in some ways that the Polish question brings together these issues of democracy, but also the importance of national self-determination, which of course is going to be a big feature in the Europe of the late 19th century. So Marx is supporting that. In terms of female activists, well, Luxembourg is important in the Second International, along with comrades like Clara Zetkin, and also Louisa Kautsky as well. And it's, I think, really a feature of the growth of the women's movement from the 1880s and the 1890s. Marx's daughters are obviously going to become quite significant figures, but at the stage that we're talking about here, in the First International, I'm not aware of, certainly from the minute books and from the speeches at the congresses, I'm not aware of prominent women who are in such an important position as they will be later on. So again, it's something I perhaps would be very interested to look at. I'm sure someone's written on it. Vera Zasulich, who's a Russian populist who becomes a Marxist, is a good example of a prominent revolutionary woman. But you know, in many countries, not only was it socially not acceptable for women to be politically active, but also it was often, you know, actually sort of excluded politically. Up until the early 20th century, women in Germany couldn't formally, by law, be members of political movements. And the Prudhonists in France, because of their idea of the family unit as being the basis of the economy, saw women as homemakers, as mothers, not as citizens. On the question about the line between Chartism, the ILP, and so on, there are individuals who sort of bring these movements forward. And it's obvious that when a new movement emerges, then people tend to look back to the immediate movement preceding it. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about Chartism in the documents of the International, and people like Harney are quite important in its early stages. But of course, we're talking about a period, the ILP develops in the early 1890s. Chartism is effectively dead by about 1850. You know, you've got a 40-year period. I think it's more a case that a sort of tradition is kept alive and is used to mobilize people. I think if any organizations do encompass that, it's often the trade unions and or some sort of local groupings where people might move from one organization to another. You know, we know in certain parts of England and Wales, for example, that you get that tradition, and I think, you know, that's probably how it operates. So it's again an interesting point, and one probably that can only be really looked at by looking at local study. Many of the people who are involved in the trade unions in Britain who are also you know, who are also involved in the International, they tend to drop out of it. If you look at the biographies of many of the people, they can be traced quite easily. You find that some of them had been involved in things like the Communist League or the Chartists, but there isn't a sort of a continuous period of membership. There's a sort of an overlapping and a transmission onwards. But I don't really see it in linear terms. But, you know, the local examples may prove me wrong. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. We've got now Steve Freeman and then Ashley Reed.
I'm unmuting myself.
You are unmuted already.
Right. Thanks, Tina, and Kevin, thank you very much for the talk. It was a great talk and very clear in your argument. So I've got a kind of question and a contribution, okay? So my question, first of all, is that clearly Marx conceived workers of the world unite. So he really conceived of the idea of a party for the world. But in reality, what we're talking about here is essentially a European party, it seems to me. That all the discussion we're having is about Europe in reality. So my question is, did it go beyond Europe? Now, the only thing I've got in my mind about this was, of course, America is about to become very important as we talk to you in other things. And I think Marx took the International to America to close it down or something like that. But I know nothing apart from that. So my question is, Kevin, do you know anything about going beyond Europe and the link with America? Now, you know, I don't know. That might be quite an obscure question. I just don't know. But that is the question. So if it's too obscure, never mind. But that's what I'm thinking about. My contribution, as it were, I wanted to just simply talk about, as a European party, you could see this as about the struggle for democracy in Europe and the combined and uneven development of the democratic struggle in Europe. And that's why Poland and Ireland are obviously important, and Italy. And when we go back to 1848, before this came about, Marx was clearly an extreme Democrat and a Republican. That's the real abiding politics that he carries into this. But what he does in Capital is to put republicanism on a materialistic basis, because he starts to link it with the development of capitalism and the development of the working class, the class that could really democratically run society. Capitalism makes that possible by creating this Republican class or democratic class, if you want to put it another way. So that is quite clearly something that Marx is working through in his development of his understanding of capital. Now, what Marx therefore understood was that the self-emancipation of the working class, it could mean that, and I think that's what Marx meant by that, in a Republican state, the working class could work out its own liberation. All right, so it could liberate itself if the political conditions of a republic, it would make possible the working out of its self-liberation, as opposed to the anarchists and the Bakuninists and people like that who said, the first thing you've got to do is abolish the state. So the number one thing is not work through the Republican argument, but actually abolish the state instead. So there's an argument between the Republican Marx and the anarchist Bakunin. And when the Paris Commune comes about, and that then makes sense, because what Marx says about the Paris Commune is that he's last discovered the form of republic within which the working class can find its own liberation. And of course, it's in the Paris Commune, this battle between the anarchists and the Republicans and communists is actually working itself out. So I think that strong democratic strain is how Marx is looking at Europe. He sees the bastion of counter-reaction is Russia. The democratic movement is Poland. The democratic movement is in Ireland. It was in Italy. It was in Germany at one point, and France, of course, is quite crucial. But the Republic has been crushed by Bonapartism. So there's another enemy that needs to be overthrown. And I can understand seems a bit strange first he'd side with Germany against, but it sort of makes, I can see a kind of logic to that, by the way. But it's absolutely true. The fall of Bonaparte opened up the door to this other republic, this new republicanism of the Paris Commune. So that's that's my it. That's my contribution.
Ashley, please.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. Yes, Kevin, I was going to ask if you can shed some light on the First International's influence, I mean, from a Marxist perspective, and how central Marx was at a time when the Industrial Revolution is gathering real pace. To a certain extent, in Marxist socialist circles, we focus on the 1889 Dockers strike as the central pivotal moment where collectivism it comes together in so many different ways. But a year prior to that, when you were talking about female feminist influences of the time in London, the radical feminist Clementina Black was central in concern to the Match Girls strike, that to a certain extent was a catalyst for the Dockers strike. But then there's only 10 years to the turn of the century, and then we're starting to preempt James Connolly, we're preempting Hardy, and some quite uniformed, organized, mobilized forces that formed the ILP. In the northeast of England, certainly the trade union movement and the labour movement, the formation of the Independent Labour Party must have been coming off the back of organisation from the late 1900s. And I just wanted your historical view on the First International from a Marxist perspective, how central Karl Marx was to extending the tendrils into areas of working class society that had no representation. But by the end of the century, we've got collectivism on a massive scale. That was my question.
Thank you, Ashley. Okay, Kevin, that was also the last question. So if you could use that to sum up, that would be marvelous.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Yes, I I'm ashamed that I didn't mention the United States, because the United States was quite important to the First International. The American Civil War, which had begun in 1861 and ended in 1865, which we had a talk on last week, was a very important movement for socialists and democrats. And indeed, in Britain, the working class movement followed that civil war very closely. They carried out all sorts of solidarity actions. The trade unions, particularly in the textile areas, were very adamant in favor of the union, in favor of the anti-slavery campaign. And indeed, famously, the First International sent an address or a sort of letter to Abraham Lincoln, and it was written by Marx. Indeed, so sort of significant was that I think it was the 1870s, maybe Dan Lazare on another occasion can tell us exactly which, but I think there was a debate in the House of Representatives which actually referred to the solidarity of British workers and the importance of that in defeating the Confederacy, given the economic ties between Lancashire, Cheshire, and the slave-owning areas of the southern states. So the United States was very important. There were working class organizations. In fact, I think Dan in his talk referred to the growth of those organizations in the aftermath of the Civil War, such as the National Union of Labour. There were trade union and labour movement congresses, and these did affiliate to the International. There were connections, and my apologies for being so Eurocentric on that point. It was significant, in particular because of the many European exiles, particularly Germans, living in the United States. Again, if you look at Marx's letters, he's often sending letters to these exiles, many of whom have a very important role in the anti-slavery movement, and many of them fight in the Civil War on the side of the Union. So, Marx saw the United States as the country of the future, as indeed it was. And so he, hoped that as a country in which capitalism was expanding, it would also be a country that would throw up a working class movement. And, it was laying down the preconditions for socialism were being laid down in that way. The decision to relocate the General Council to the United States in 1872 is an interesting one. And there is a certain amount of disagreement as to whether this was in effect a policy to close down the International and transfer it, in a sense, out of harm's way from Europe. I think the consensus of opinion is that Marx did see that if an international movement was going to develop, then America would be very important in that. And the idea that Solga would be the secretary and based in the United States, was actually going to be quite important. So you're accurate on that point, Steve, about its importance. I'm not aware of any movements in any other parts of the world. For example, any of the colonial countries. I'm sure that if we look at the history of revolutionary movements across the various colonial empires, I'm sure that we will find that Marxist ideas were beginning to emerge and develop. If the experience of Russia is anything to go by, then ideas are creeping out. But I'm afraid I don't know. Again, that's a weakness in my reading, which I will have to rectify in that way. On your wider point about republicanism, yes, I think that's quite important. And obviously the demand for a republic and the democratic republic, the demand for political rights, right to vote, I think is significant. Why it is significant is that this is a challenge to much of the existing republicanism, because there is obviously a strand in Europe of republicanism, particularly in France, but that's rather nostalgic. And above all, it's not really linked to the idea that the republic gives the political space for the working class to organize and to effectively challenge for power. And the republicanism in France is often a nostalgic hark back to the French Revolution. It's also in many ways a petty bourgeois movement that tends to lionize the Jacobins, the sans-culottes, the petty bourgeois elements in that revolution. So I think that in establishing that Marx is an extreme Democrat and is a Republican, he's also linking this to the idea of the role of linking this to working class struggle, and arguing that the Republic gives the working class the political space and political rights. And it's that, I think, that's so significant. He's not arguing, for example, that existing politicians, whether they call themselves radical or Republicans or whatever, will carry out the task of emancipation. He's also arguing that the French Revolution didn't abolish classes. It might have formally done that, but class still exists, and particularly the exploitation of the working class is still a factor. So yes, I think republicanism is important, but it's the class element that we see in that opening proclamation, where he's trying to establish a distinct working class politics. Ashley's point about the influence of Marx and indeed on later movements and the First International, I suppose, is an interesting one, because and it did come up a little bit in one of the earlier talks I did about the British Labour movement. It was always a cliche, and it was usually done to attack Marxists and people on the left, that the British Labour movement owed more to Methodism than to Marx. And the argument was that revolutionary ideas were very alien in Britain, peaceful development. There were one or two minor skirmishes, one or two minor problems, but in general, a peaceful, stable society. So if we're looking for the influence of Marx's ideas, and particularly the ideas of the First International, we can find them. But we also have to bear in mind that Marx's ideas, Marx's pamphlets and so forth, were not as widely available as they were later to become. So, for example, the Communist Manifesto, which is translated into English in 1850, is available along with a number of other smaller pamphlets. But and also some of Marx's journalism, some of his work on the Paris Commune. But the Capital is obviously also being translated into this later period. But much of the influence of Marx's ideas comes through individuals who've read them, or in the case of a few people who've actually met Marx and Engels and have absorbed their ideas that way. So the type of access to Marxist literature and so forth, and therefore the creation of a Marxist current, I think is much more problematic. In the 1880s, a number of groups are formed. Social Democratic Federation is one of them. And then later there's a split. The Socialist League is formed, and these will all contribute to the Independent Labour Party. But the transmission of Marx's ideas, I think, often comes through individuals. For example, Heinemann, who's the leader of the Social Democratic Federation, writes a book called England for All, which is a very bowdlerized form of Marxism. And he doesn't credit Marx at all, more or less says these are my ideas, but they're clearly Marxist ideas. It's also clear that people like Engels, who is, influential, I mean, he's an old man, by the early 1890s, but he does have some influence, and you know, Jenny Marx as well is also quite an influential figure. So there are people who are in a sense trying to keep the flame going, but in comparison with the German Social Democratic Party, which has a mass organization, even though it's under, you know, very repressive circumstances, has numerous newspapers and magazines, and indeed, you know, is publishing a lot of Marxist work and discussing Marxism, then the British theoretical tradition is, I think, fairly limited. But there are people in Britain who are, you know, influenced by Marxism, and indeed many of those will be people who are also connected, you know, to the International, or even if they react against it, as in the case of the Fabians, they will be influenced by it, you know, albeit in a negative way. So I'll just conclude then as I began, which is to say that I think the interesting thing about the First International is the emergence of a distinct working class politics, a distinct working class organization. Above all, the idea of an international organization, that the political emancipation of the working class is an international movement, that national roads to socialism, that can't be achieved, that capitalism is a world system, and therefore the working class is a world class. It will be a class that can only emancipate itself internationally, and the First International is one of the ways of doing that. So the discussions around organization, about the relationship between the General Council as a leadership and the various federations and the individual members, these are all going to be, you know, very significant features. People are still trying to work out the nature of how they should organize, and, you know, how, for example, adherence to a particular program, you know, a clear set of principles, what those principles should be. I think the other issue that does clearly emerge is a very clear Marxist politics, which emerges through debate, but also in response to the situations that are emerging. So the Paris Commune throws up questions about how socialists interpret the state and how they deal with the state, you know, both in a positive and in a negative way. But also it makes a clear distinction between ideas of anarchism and ideas of Marxism and what will later become social democracy, particularly with the focus on the need for a political program and for the working class to adopt that program, and for the working class to be the class that will emancipate itself. So these are all still issues, you know, the International looks at those issues, and it obviously in the wider sense, you know, had a very problematic and you know, short-lived existence. But it does, I think, leave us with a body of experience and a body of ideas which are still worth studying. And of course, as we're building our own movements, and as we're, you know, confronting capitalism in its period of decline, then you know, we can learn a lot from that. And then one last point, and I think it goes back to the question that Zbigniew asked about Poland and indeed about international relations, that issues which traditionally had been confined to the chancelleries of Europe, had been confined to the leader columns of a few elite newspapers, were now being discussed by working class people. So questions of war and peace, questions of democracy, questions of the future of states and the future of continents, these were no longer going to be decided, you know, by those above us, by the elites, by the ruling classes. These were now going to be issues that we would take a stand on, that we wouldn't just be cannon fodder, we wouldn't just be given a gun and told who to kill. We would now have our own interests, and we would decide the best solutions for the working class. We would take an active interest in high politics and international affairs. And Marx, you know, makes that very plain that that this is a movement that is going to will begin the emancipation of the working class and be a class that will now decisively move onto the stage of history and will decisively start to shape its own destiny. It will now become a power amongst the other powers in Europe and indeed in the world.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was brilliant. I think it's quite shameful that we're so far behind where these comrades were 150 years ago. Almost appears we've made quite a step back there, despite it being much easier today to organize internationally, etc. But definitely the working class as a world class is something we have to definitely take away and continue to work on. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thanks everybody for joining. See you soon.